So first of all, TikTok has major problems. I have probably been, if you rewind even a few years, even before I was running for president, at the leading edge of pointing out a lot of the issues with addictive social media across the board, particularly with TikTok, and a position that I've adopted since the start of the campaign. I think I said this on day one, and I maintain today, is that I think there is a reasonable case to be made for addictive social media, algorithmically powered addictive social media, to be banned outright in kids under the age of 16. That would include TikTok. It would also include other platforms. But here's where I land. I prefer to, all else equal, when we have a choice, ban the bad behavior, not the individual actor or the individual company, because that sets a terrible precedent. So there's three major issues with TikTok as I see it, right? I'm not some sort of TikTok fan apologist. To the contrary, we got to see the problem with clear eyes. Problem number one is addictive tendencies in kids. Problem number two is forced data transfers or the potential of forced data transfers to the Chinese Communist Party. And problem number three is the people who run that platform, which could be the CCP, engaging in system-wide persuasion control, effectively tilting the levers of what people do or don't see.
Sure.
Each of those are three separate problems. Here's my issue with this bill, is that this neither addresses those concerns, any of them, and I can explain why, while also massively expanding the authority of the federal government, particularly the executive branch, particularly President Biden right now, to be able to censor the speech of political opponents in ways that have nothing to do with TikTok. So the bill is both over-inclusive while also failing to do the thing that it supposedly is purporting to do. And the reason why is anytime you're in the business of creating a bill to go after one company, one actor, what our founding fathers referred to as bills of attainder, this is a constitutional prohibition anyway. I think there's a good chance this would get challenged in the courts and thrown out for this very reason. That's a formula for abuse. And so I can go into detail on each of those points.
Well, what you listed 3 points, right? I believe?
Yeah.
3 points. Number two, I just want to make sure I have this right. Number two was that it is overly expansive. Do I have that right?
I would say just to go clear, it doesn't matter what order we go in. One is the addictive tendencies in kids.
Yeah.
Two is forced data transfers to the CCP of U.S. user information.
Mm-hmm.
And number three is broad-scale persuasion, using the tool as a persuasive tool to ideologically shift the U.S. dialogue or discourse in a way that might favor a foreign adversary rather than the United States.
So
those are three independent concerns, which I think are serious.
Yes, no, and I agree
we got to deal with them.
But here's the thing: this bill does address number 2 and 3. It doesn't address the addictive tendencies. It does address 2 and 3, and especially people like I do think. And here's the thing: sitting around with Section 230 and having been banned, demonetized on YouTube, banned from TikTok for literally making fun of Xi Jinping. That's why we were banned from TikTok repeatedly. This is addressed in a way that says, okay, look.
I didn't know that, but that's interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. We did a trash TikTok, but it was just trashing the CCP. And we made very clear to say we're not trashing the Chinese people, but the CCP. I mean, a lot completely untoward jokes toward Xi Jinping. I think he's earned it, but that's just me, Mr. Old-Fashioned.
It's disgusting. That's disgusting when China does it. It's disgusting when we do similar things in the United States. I don't know why you're demonetized on YouTube, but I suspect it could relate to speech that the U.S. government finds offensive, and it's bad no matter who does it.
Well, when senators like Hirono and Pelosi are out there saying Mr. Crowder needs to be banned, and they say he hasn't violated policy, so we'll just remove millions of dollars. However, nothing ever happens with those. This is a rare instance where something can happen, and I would actually argue that the reason this can get bipartisan support is because of the specificity. Because of the specificity, it says for foreign adversaries, 20% ownership. If the data transfers occur, if they are headquartered or domiciled in these other countries, it is more specific than, for example, some of the left's legislation of hate speech or misinformation. So it's one of the rare instances. I don't believe in common ground based on a lie.
So if I may push back on that for just a second.
Sure.
So this is an issue near and dear to my heart. I wrote about this in Woke Inc. It is a myth that Chinese ownership of the company is the only source of leverage that China has in order to decide how, say, data is or is not transferred to the behavior of companies. To the contrary, we have far greater evidence of even U.S. companies that do business in China handing over U.S. user data to the CCP than we have for TikTok itself. I'll give you a very specific example. Airbnb, a U.S. domiciled company, supposedly with principally U.S. shareholders. A few years ago, solid Wall Street Journal reporting on this. I talk about it in greater detail in my book, Woke Inc., my first one. Handing over U.S. user data of its customers. People have probably used Airbnb. The private messages sent between renters and hosts. Geolocational data. The private data of U.S. users handed over to the CCP, presumably as a condition for Airbnb being able to do business in China. So the fact that Airbnb isn't Chinese owned doesn't stop it from doing that. So my point about this bill being under-inclusive is if the problem is transferring U.S. user data to the CCP, transferring the ownership matters very little as long as there's another lever for actual control over those companies.
I agree
and that's a major problem.
I do agree
I can go
with
into
it.
greater detail of other examples.
I agree
so
with
I
that.
think that the idea that we're just going to, now we change the ownership of this one company, massively expanded President Biden's authority to determine what platform does or doesn't count as being controlled by a foreign adversary to be able to shut it down, I think is a massive civil libertarian risk without really any juice to address the core concern of Chinese leverage over the United States, when in fact that leverage plays out through so many levers other than equity ownership, against the backdrop of the further irony that we have companies from Google to Airbnb that have shown greater leverage to the Chinese Communist Party
Vivek,
than this Chinese-owned company.
If I may push back, I agree with you, by the way. Last time I was in an Airbnb, I found a camera in the two-way mirror. I knew it was the CCP, and I said, get a look, because I'm confident. I'm right at the bell curve of average, but, it's okay. So my point here is I understand that. However, those bills don't exist. TikTok does. There is not. I agree with you. This happens not only with Facebook and with YouTube in the terms that they want their content to be palatable to foreign countries, right? And so they throttle content, just like we saw with the NBA, for example, where they couldn't speak out. They couldn't even acknowledge Taiwan. That happens.
NBA, BlackRock, Disney, you go straight down the list. There's a lot of leverage for expanding into the Chinese market. So we agree on that.
We completely agree.
Spend a lot of time on that.
But this does.
Your point is this bill does one specific thing.
Yes.
Why not just do this?
There's a starting point, right? You're not going to get a bill that will establish, hey, you guys can't allow this leverage even in catering to the content of foreign adversaries or transferring data. You can get a bill that says, okay.
I think there's a very clean bill that should be passed. This is one that I would vehemently support. If I'm not in Congress right now, thank God, but I think I would be able to. If I were, I would push for this. Is a clean bill, irrespective of ownership, irrespective of domicile. It is fundamentally illegal for any U.S. holder of U.S. user data to transfer that data to the Chinese government or its affiliates. Period. Put an end to the practice. And that's how we do things in the United States of America. There's an undesired behavior. We go after that regardless of who's actually doing it. And that reveals what's really going on, because I do think we're falling for a kind of trick here. One of the people playing the trick is it's a combination of, I think, a Biden-led administrative state that wants to expand its executive authority, an administration that's already been using platforms like Facebook, pressuring them through the back door to go after its political opponents, to expand the range of who they're able to go after. But to bring this full circle, here's the dirty little secret in Washington, D.C. You know who's advocating for this bill? It's really the lobbyists hired by that very company, Facebook. And so we are falling for a Facebook-led lobbying campaign to deflect attention from the reality of Facebook engaging in some of the same behaviors it's accusing TikTok of, getting in bed with the government actor, not quite the CCP here, but the deep state in the United States of America, doing the same thing, deflecting attention, effectively sidelining one competitor while actually being the product of one company's self-interested lobbying, as opposed to a full-fledged ban of the underlying behavior that actually would ensnare Facebook and Google and Airbnb, but which those companies have effectively lobbied their way out of being.
Well, that's the point, though, right? Nothing's going to happen there. You're not going to. Here is a bill where something can happen. In other words, how would bringing TikTok under a U.S. entity, right, hinder our ability to restrict data? It's a step. You're not going to get. This is the same reason that the Democratic. By the way, I'm agreeing with you. The radical left Democratic wing oppose this bill. The AOCs of the world. Why? Because they love being favored by the algorithms of Facebook and X.
That's independent reason.
Sorry, not X, but what used to be Twitter, right? At one point in time, YouTube, of course. But at this point, there's something before us that says, okay, here's a way to take a step. And by the way, President Trump supported it back then until he was against it. I'm sure that you've heard people say.
First of all, I would say one thing about that. Federal courts rescinded that ban, right? And I do think that federal courts, and I think the Supreme Court, will come down against this one as well for some of the same reasons. Came down against that because that was an executive order, but it will come down against this one in part because of the expansive abuses inherent in a law that's this vague and this broad, directed effectively at one company that vests this much authority in the chief executive and the president. And I don't think we do ourselves any favors by saying, oh, there's a bill only to see it rescinded, just like it happened last time around by the Supreme Court or by federal courts. I think that there's an opportunity where if you're just a consumer, and I take an average person home and say, okay, something's come up, why not just sign that? I'm interested in the process by which it comes up.
Well, just to be clear, they rescinded the bill. I want to be clear. They rescinded the bill because they said it was outside the purview of the executive order. The bill did go through Congress, and I guess this does bring me to my
But it vests
question.
the authority in the executive. One thing in this bill is it vests the sole authority in the U.S. president to make these determinations, which I think is a civil libertarian nightmare. If you think President Biden has unfairly, indirectly censored political opposition through the back door of tech companies, then it's probably a bad idea to give him even greater latitude to do it directly through the front door of this law.
I completely agree with the sentiment. I just have read that. I completely agree with the sentiment. And you know that this has been my cause du jour long before anyone else has even come along the trail. We were demonetized. I've been on YouTube since 2009. 2006, I've watched it grow. I agree with everything you've just said, except this bill is specific enough that it doesn't do that. And I think you're going to have a really hard time saying, well, this bill is too broad, and then get any kind of traction with the bill that would say, undue influence and the ability to have data transfer to a foreign entity of any kind. This is for specific adversaries listed, a specific type of ownership listed, either it being headquartered or domiciled, something that specific. If we say that that can't happen, something more broad has no chance in hell. That's a worry.
Yeah, so I respectfully, and there's a good dialogue. I just respectfully disagree with that because it's too specific in some ways and too broad in others. It's too broad in the authority that it gives the U.S. president to make a determination, and it's randomly specific in a way that's specifically designed to exclude the very U.S. companies that lobbied for it. That's where the specificity comes from. Ownership is not the only lever that matters when you have the likes of Google that claimed publicly, told all of us, that it was exiting China under its "Don't Be Evil" mantra, only to see years later that they had Project Dragonfly working with the CCP to create a censored search engine in China that was completely publicly not disclosed, a government contracting project with China, until leaks actually revealed it. The instances with Airbnb, I could enumerate other instances. The specificity was paid for by the lobbyists to carve out U.S. companies from being excluded, the very U.S. companies that are threatened by TikTok's growing market share, not by TikTok's actual behavior. Versus the actual breadth and specificity is this. If a U.S. user has not expressly consented, not in some litany of general warranties that you just sign at the bottom through an adhesive agreement, but specific express consent to have their user data transferred to a government, either domestic or foreign, then a company cannot do it, period. I think it's that simple. And I think if we go to the hard nuts and bolts of the real issue lurking underneath all of this, which is the data privacy and who owns the data of individual users that we're handing over to all of these tech companies, from TikTok to Chinese-owned to American-owned but Chinese-influenced. That's what we need to do. And I think we should have broad bipartisan support. And if we don't, it smokes out the reason why. It's because U.S. companies are lobbying against doing the thing that actually needs to be done. And so I don't take that for given, right? Because there's a reasonable point of view to say, okay, we live in a broken system. There's all kinds of broken lobbying from these Silicon Valleys who control these congressmen anyway. And so if the Silicon Valley companies control them and we take that for granted, then if this is the best we're going to get, let's at least go for it. I don't take that for granted. Right. I think the best way to deal with that broken system is to name the problem. And that's why I'm naming exactly what's going on here. Anybody in Washington, D.C. knows the dirty little secret here is this is Facebook paid for multi-million-dollar lobbying campaign. The fake specificity is designed to exclude the very companies that have lobbied for it. And I say hell no to that system. There is a serious problem here of forced data transfers to the CCP. Deal with it. Deal with it directly. And you know what? If Airbnb or Google or anybody else is ensnared, so be it, because they should be. And the fact that they paid a bunch of lobbyists here more effectively than the other guys should not determine which laws we do or do not pass.
I agree with everything in spirit. I would have one disagree. Well, I would ask you to just laser in on one point here. You said because of TikTok's ownership, not their behavior. Do you actually believe that TikTok's behavior, their algorithms, and how they control content is not at least as egregious as Facebook?
I don't have as much evidence for that. The truth is we don't have as much transparency into TikTok, but the ultimate irony of this, Stephen, is that if you look at the most egregious behaviors in the last 10 years of state actors pressuring a tech company to censor or moderate content in a particular way, engage in persuasion, tilting the scales of elections, engaging in forced data transfers to governments without permission, the places where we have greatest evidence of that, hard evidence, is actually for our U.S. tech companies in Silicon Valley working hand in glove in bed with U.S. deep state
I completely agree.
That's where we have the plainest evidence.
Yes.
And so it's beyond bizarre that where we have the plainest evidence, we turn the other way. But where we have good circumstantial evidence to be concerned, That's where we've created the lightning rod when it advantages the very companies for whom we have the most damning evidence. So I just think we've got to be data-driven there.
No, I completely agree. But you look, come on, Vivek. You're a brilliant man. You're a genius, far smarter than I. And you know that it will always be circumstantial evidence because we can't get to the evidence because of the lack of transparency of TikTok because of the Chinese ownership.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything. I'm saying we should do something that will have a significantly restrictive impact on TikTok, but it will also have a restrictive impact on anybody else who's trying to do the same thing. And let me just give you one more example here is many of the top apps in the App Store are Chinese, actually, in the Apple App Store. TikTok is the one that managed to capture the public imagination right now.
Right.
Even if you're looking at Chinese ownership, what are they going to do? They're going to effectively divest them through intermediary shell companies that have ownership that isn't technically Chinese at the top. It's gameable. And so the specificity, the so-called specificity of this that was designed to exclude U.S. companies that lobbied for it will also render this ineffective. Play this forward 2 years. This bill is going to have no impact other than forcing a divestment of one random company and a bunch of virtue signaling Republicans patting themselves on the back. 20 years later, when you have a regime that's then censoring political speech, using this as the basis to do it, decrying how we ever got here, exactly what we say about Republicans passing the Patriot Act 20 years ago. And so I just think as a Republican Party, we need to grow up and get back to first principles, stop being pawns of the lobbyists that pay these politicians and use them as puppets, and say if there's a behavior that's problematic, and I identify 3 that are relevant to TikTok that are absolutely problematic,
Sure.
Great. Ban the behavior. Have the courage to do it rather than have Facebook write up some sort of legislation with some fake specificity to exclude Mark Zuckerberg-founded Meta and then put it up and say, this is what we have to sign. That's garbage, and I refuse to just play by the, be a price taker, if you will, of what that broken lobbyist-influenced system puts up. And instead go back to actually first principles to say that if we're at first principles, this isn't the bill we'd be passing. We'd be stopping forced data transfers to the Chinese. We'd be protecting young people from addiction on social media. And anytime a content platform is working with any state actor to engage in persuasion by up-regulating or down-regulating or censoring speech, that's a backdoor constitutional violation, and we deem it to be illegal. That's the course of action we should take, and I would be the first and strongest proponent for it. And so you have others. Then now you go to the AOCs of the world. They're not going to be for that.
No, of course
right?
not.
You go to many on the left. They're not going to be for that. That's what we need to be for.
And by the way, there won't be enough. There won't be enough
nonsense.
Republicans for that. I can't tell you how many conversations that we've had here with congressmen and senators who've talked about. Then we hear them quoting us and using our data in Senate hearings and doing nothing. Why? Because they all have podcasts and they all have giant Facebook pages and they want to play ball with them. So I agree with everything.
But let me say a word about this. I mean, there's a reason why Trump, Elon Musk, Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, myself, I think Tucker, I was reading, but it's a diverse array of libertarian and libertarian nationalist voices. I don't consider myself just a pure libertarian. I'm a libertarian nationalist. I do believe that the world stage is a jungle, and we have to play by the rules of the autocrats on the globe. We don't have to play by their rules, but we have to acknowledge that they're not playing by our rules when we protect ourselves as a country. So I'm not some blithe, Friedmanite, dreaming libertarian just believing that everybody plays by our fantasy rules. No. Yeah. We have serious issues with foreign adversaries that we actually need to deal with, but don't be duped into tricking ourselves to think that we did it when we didn't, while actually behaving more like the adversary in the process. That's where I land.
Well, one final question, and Vivek, you know that we love you, appreciate you, of course. One thing I will say too, because you've talked about, and I agree on not only foreign adversary, but on the funding that comes from lobbyist groups. Yep. Everyone you just mentioned, including yourself, money from Jeff Yass, who owns a $33 billion stake in ByteDance. You're never going to get away from that question from your critics. Everyone you just named, it's a diverse coalition, except for one through
Everybody should ask the question, right? Yeah. So I think for a lot of politicians, that'd be a reasonable question. Just get to the truth of the matter, right? In my case, you got a guy who's funded a bunch of Republican candidates, as far as I know. You got, in my case, just look at the facts. People know what my net worth is. It's public. Look at how much I put into the campaign. It's public, too.
Yes.
Do you think that the positions that I've taken in the campaign, do you think that those have been ones that have earned me more donors or lost me more donors? I probably lost tens, if not maybe even $100 million plus donations over the course of the campaign because of positions I took on foreign policy and elsewhere. And I put 30 million on my own, and probably would have put a lot more on if I stayed in the race. So if everyone has to make their own judgment, but well, it's a lot of money I put in. I can't say what a lot of what someone might have consumed. But what I will say is that people should make their own judgments, right? Think for yourself, think independently. And I just encourage you to do the same thing with respect to who's actually putting up this particular bill. And I do think that it's important not to See, the equivalent of me in this debate would have been to say, not make any other points I made, but just say Facebook is funding the bill, and that's it.
Right.
Not offer any other counter argument on the
I agree.
merits.
And you didn't.
Okay. Well, like that would be like an ad hominem attack on Facebook.
Right.
But you can't use that as a substitute for engaging on the merits.
Right.
So if you want to say that, any of these politicians or myself or whatever else was supported by some guy, great, say it. But then don't use that as a substitute for engaging on the merits.
I agree.
Because the merits should be what govern.
I agree. And I do think very important merit would be that entire coalition putting together and pushing for a bill that would require the kind of legislation that you claim would be productive, that would relate to Facebook, YouTube, X, and TikTok. And TikTok. Yep. I haven't seen it yet. That's the issue. It doesn't exist, and it's never going to happen until we start with something specific. Because you know what? We've been getting battered out.
If I ran for president, and I've been talking about this on the campaign trail, if I ever were president, you can take it to the bank that I would push head and shoulders all the way down for actual robust legislation to deal with this threat. But I actually want to deal with the threat rather than pretending to, while creating a civil libertarian nightmare in the process.
And I hope that you would push head and shoulders, or at least Selsun Blue, for me to be reinstated on TikTok.
I was setting you up for that.
There you go.
Started with
all right.
cosmetics, so we got to finish with
Vivek, I know you got to go. Where's the best place for people to find you and support you? I appreciate you making the case here.
Thank you. It's any social media, whatever. I should,
TikTok
I'm not hard to find.
TikTok him. Yeah. All right. Hey, Vivek, hope to have you back in studio soon, brother. Thank you very much.